Thank you so much for coming out tonight on this Friday afternoon or evening. My name is Jelka. I'm a bookseller here with Oblong Books, and it's my pleasure to host tonight's event. Before we start, I would like to give you a few housekeeping notes, announcements. We are selling the book that we're talking about tonight. You can purchase the book after the talk here with me. We also have the book of our conversation partner in stock that you can purchase after, and we have a couple of events coming up that might be interesting for you to check out. They're all on our website, oblongbooks.com. Next week we have sort of a mystery crime week with Clémence Michalin and Carol Goodman, both local authors. So do check in on our website. Registration is usually easy to find there in our events calendar. For tonight, I'm excited to have an interesting podium here. We have, as a conversation partner, we have Jessica Brier. She's a curator of photography at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College, and also the editor of On the Grid, Ways of Seeing in Print, and co-editor of Making a Life in Photography, Raleigh McKenna. And she's going to be in conversation with Anika Burgess. She's a photo editor and writer whose work has been published in the New York Times and in Atlas Obscura, and she lives in New York. And her book, Flashes of Brilliance, is now available, and we're going to hear about the book tonight. So without further ado, I will give the stage to you both, and have fun tonight. I'll start with reading.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I'm going to start by reading just a short section from the very beginning of the book, from the introduction, and it is called Sights Unseen. Imagine for a moment that you're in London in the mid-1840s and you decided to have your portrait taken by a photographer for the very first time. The studio is open only during daylight hours, so in an English winter it closes at around 4 p.m. It's located in the upper floors of a building for better access to sunlight. After walking up the stairs and entering the studio, you notice blue-tinted skylights across the ceiling. By some miracle, it's not raining and there's little fog, which is fortunate. You've read that in duller weather, the exposure time would be longer. If the photographer is diligent, the glass will be clean and not grimy with soot and coal from the city's industries. If you're a woman, you'll be glad that you had the privacy of a women-only waiting room in which you could check your appearance. You're wearing satin, which you read was best for photographic portraits. You also read that while posing, to avoid your mouth from looking too severe, it helps to say the word prunes. You spot the camera, a wooden box-like object with an intimidatingly large brass tube at the front, stranger in person than in the drawings you've seen in the press. Opposite it, on a raised dais, you see a chair and a vertical iron rod with a clamp. The photographer fiddles with a series of blinds to adjust the light. And after you are seated in the chair, the photographer, or his assistant, if he has one, positions the clamp to firmly hold the back of your head, and it keeps you in a stiff and still upright position. And he tells you to make a fist, or clasp your skirt, or the chair, anything to stop the merest tremble in your hands, which are now slightly sweaty because it's warm under the skylights and you're getting nervous. The photographer disappears into an anteroom, returning with something in his hands that he puts into the camera. He says it's a plate holder, and then he fusses with the camera some more and tells you not to move under any circumstances, and now the moment has come. He uncaps the lens and counts the exposure. You've watched all of this without, hopefully, a flicker of movement. You're fastened in position, hot under the skylights, and trying to mouth the word prunes. It feels an interminable amount of time, although the photographer reveals that the exposure, which he estimated by the light and his own experience, was a mere 20 seconds. When at last it's over, and the photographer has reappeared from his mysterious darkroom, he presents you with your portrait. It's a daguerreotype, a portrait on silver-coated metal plate, protected by a glass cover, mounted in a brass frame, in a case lined with velvet, wrapped in leather. It's small, but for the first time in your life, you have a permanent impression of how you look, or at least how you looked at that moment, as the light filtered down through the blue glass, into the lens, and onto the plate, capturing you. or a version of you. Maybe you're charmed by it. Maybe you're horrified. There is a decent chance you're horrified. The daguerreotype does not flatter, wrote one French commentator with a degree of understatement. Another said, more brutally, that some daguerreotype portraits resemble fried fish stuck fast to a silver plate. Maybe it is a keepsake for your children. You don't have any photographs of your own parents. No one does. Their faces only exist in your memory unless you could afford a painted portrait. Even then, a painting is subjective, more flattering than accurate, whereas this new daguerreotype process is said to be an imprint of nature, drawn by the sun itself. What you're now holding in your hands is the first photographic record of you, conjured up by a camera, chemicals, and light. Thank you. So that was the introduction, or part of the introduction.
I love that we're starting with you giving a reading, because it really just throws you right into the kind of narrative of this book. I've personally read a lot of historical books about photography, about this period, but so seldom do people actually capture the kind of wildness of this moment and these practices. And I love that you really sort of bring that out.
Thank you.
So I'm so glad that we started there.
Great. I'm so pleased to hear that.
Because it really was a kind of like Wild West, right? And that's really what the book is about, right?
It is.
So much play and experimentation and risk-taking and all of these things that are not in any way kind of sanitized.
Absolutely.
Right?
And most of them are without regard for one's own physical safety. I have to add that as well.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to start with this idea of what it was like to get your portrait taken for the first time ever was to really capture the excitement that came with photography, and also to kind of as a counterpoint to, I think, what is a common perception, which is if you see an old portrait or a landscape or a photograph from the earliest days of photography, it might feel a little stuffy, and you might therefore associate that maybe it was also kind of a boring time. And as you were saying, it really wasn't. And that's one of the major themes of the book is all the daring, exciting, slightly dangerous experiments that took place in these early years of photography.
So maybe we can talk about some examples of that.
Great.
Maybe by way of sort of the origins of the project, how
Yeah.
you came to write a book about this subject.
Great. Well, I stumbled across a photograph of a diver underwater. He had a helmet, old-fashioned diving suit on, and it was clearly taken from a camera that was underwater, and it was said to be from the 1890s. And I found that extraordinary. And I hadn't really considered at that point, the origins of underwater photography. It's a very specific genre. It feels like a very modern genre of photography too, but of course it isn't. And then once I started researching it, I realized that there was way more to the early years of photography than many people realize. And so from this underwater experiments, which went throughout the 1890s, although actually they started in the 1850s, which is really mind-blowing. From there, I expanded out into all the other genres and areas where there was scope for experimentation beyond portraits and landscapes. And even within portraits and landscapes, there was a lot of experimentation happening. If you consider, for example, photo manipulation.
So when we talk about risk-taking, one way of defining that is physical risk,
Yeah.
right? These were, a lot of these practices were very physically onerous. When we talk about experimentation with photography, right, we're talking about some really dangerous chemicals and explosive materials.
Yes, that question. I mean, this is one of the early chapters in the book is about the frustration photographers had with light.
Yeah.
Because of course, photography, if you take the date as 1839, which is when the daguerreotype was announced, there was no electricity. So here was this amazing, phenomenal, earth-shattering new process that required light. And artificial light was very difficult to come by and not strong enough for photography. So, the experiments that just took place within the field of artificial light alone, and particularly what led to the ultimately flash powder, which was a very dangerous compound that photographers used and experimented with in their own darkrooms and lost their lives in many instances. And what's remarkable to me is after flash powder sort of became in use, despite the dangers, it remained in use for 40 years. And it was a long time because people still wanted to be able to take photographs, in the dark, at night, underwater, not underwater, in a cave, basically anywhere they could.
Yeah, and I think we often think about photography as being kind of like immediately taking hold because it showed the world as it is, right? We have sort of a trust in the medium for that reason. But actually a lot of the early uses, just right from the very beginning, were showing things as you could never see them, right?
Yeah.
Like seeing in the dark. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this idea of artificial light like happens right away.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we think about Nadar, who's a very famous French photographer. He's a real showman. He's a character that I really have a strange affinity for because I feel like he was such a strong self-promoter and really had no sense of self-preservation and experimented with building enormous balloons and taking camera down into the catacombs in Paris. But it's a great example. You know, nobody had taken a camera down there before, and he took it down with an arc lamp and I think something like 3,000 feet of wires so he could power his batteries to his lamp, just to take photographs of skeletons under Paris. And you know, why not do it? I mean, this is what I also love, this idea of here is this new medium, let's try to stretch it in new ways. That's what I really enjoy about this. And I think, you know, even if you're thinking about a portrait, and again, which is what I was hoping would be captured by the part that I read, even getting a portrait taken, the photographer was dealing with a lot of chemicals in the darkroom. I mean, daguerreotype involved mercury, right? The wet collodion process involved gun cotton and ether. It continued on for 60 years. To the point in which, you know, at a certain time, photojournals published what they called a handy table of anecdotes. So should you accidentally swallow whatever was in your darkroom, let's name it hydrochloric acid, ammonia, cyanide, there was sort of a table of remedies of what you could take to hopefully counteract the lethal effects.
So this was a high risk and hopefully high reward practice.
Yeah, but not always high rewarded, I think, right?
Hopefully, hopefully. And I mean, that's something really fascinating too. When we take a picture now, we know what's going to result from it, right? But, you know, going underwater in 1850 and trying to take a picture, you really don't know what you're going to get, right? It really is, the result is also a total kind of mystery.
Yep.
And that's really kind of wild to think about. And again, you kind of bring that alive in a way that is really new, I think.
Well, thank you, and I'm really happy to hear that. And I think what else, just to add to that, is that nobody really there were no manuals anyone could look at, right? I mean, people that were working, I mean, the underwater is a great example. You know, this individual in 1856 rode out of Weymouth Bay in the south of England with his camera inside a wooden box, and he lowered it on a little cord and pulled the shutter open. He had it wasn't like there was a manual of underwater photography he could go and look at. There was barely manuals on photography, really. But he wanted to try it and see what was going to happen. And that spirit of curiosity is, to me, admirable. Just maybe with more safeguards.
Yeah, luckily, I guess, they were not scared to do any of this.
Yeah, or maybe they were and they still
Maybe they
for
should.
it. Maybe should have been
more. So one of the big themes of the book, right, is the kind of tension between using photography as a medium of art and as a kind of tool of science. But we've also talked about, right, the kind of slippage between art and science. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I find it really fascinating because when you think about photography and what it came from, it was born from science, you know, and as I read in the introduction briefly, at the time the advertisements were saying it's like a painting from the sun itself, right? It is a direct picture taken by chemicals and light, and human interaction as minimal. It is all science-based. But of course that wasn't true, and that was never true. And what came from that was this real tension between what is photography's role. Is it to be this recorder of facts, to use science to record the world as we see it, or can or should photography be used in a way that is more artistic, that maybe grows from the imagination? And there was a lot of debate about that for a really long time. Because I think, from my view, I wonder if the assumption came from the fact that it was based in science, that it was seen to be this tool that was going to be really helpful for mapping the moon, and it was going to be really helpful for all these other objective scientific spheres, and not used for, say, for example, to create a scene using any number of negatives, which of course did happen as well.
Right. But that tension is really built in, right? There are all these different characters inventing different technologies at the same time, right? And you kind of lay out this array of characters, right? And some were scientists, were like coming from the scientific world, and others were very much not, right? Daguerre was coming from the world of theater.
Yeah.
He was an illusionist, right? He was very much about creating images that certainly weren't made by nature or evidence of something that clearly exists, right? So all of that is kind of built in.
Yeah, it's true. It really is. And even if you think about, and I think I use this example in the book of a picture of a boulevard in Paris, it's Boulevard du Temple, where Daguerre took this image of this street, this wide, beautiful boulevard in Paris, and it appears deserted. You're thinking it must have been taken, maybe it was early in the morning. Why is it no? Maybe it was people had left town. It's like a ghost town. Of course, it wasn't. It was actually an incredibly busy street in Paris at the time, but the exposure was so long it couldn't capture any of the motion that was happening. And if you look very carefully, you can see one figure of a man who was having his shoe shined. He was the only person that was still for the exposure. So even then, I feel like there was this tension, like you were saying, between ostensibly this is a street scene, we can take it as fact, it's showing a direct picture of what Paris looked like, here's the street, but actually it's not fully accurate.
Not at all. It's nothing like what the street really was. Yeah.
And of course in black and white as well. I mean, it's not also reflecting the world.
Right. So right away, photography is kind of its own language of looking at the world.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. And a language that I think, it's a great metaphor. I think that as a language that people were figuring out how to learn as they were doing it, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like they were figuring it out as they were trying to speak it.
Yeah.
And that really came through in my research too. When you read the photojournals of the era, there's a lot of very spirited debates going on. A lot of very passionate opinions about what this new form should do, could do, and how to use it.
So maybe we should talk a little more about your research and your sources, kind of how this came together in the research.
Yeah. So read a lot. My eyesight got worse.
The prescription
changed dramatically. 19th century journals have very small text. So yeah, I'm obviously reading widely from books that were written recently, but really delving into these journals that really started to come to life from sort of the 1840s onwards. And fortunately for me, because I was working on this in the early days of COVID, many of them are scanned and available online, accessible through the New York Public Library. And so it was through those journals that I really started to get a sense of the personalities, get a sense of the experimentation that was going on, and oftentimes just lose hours of a day. Sometimes it was hard to stop because it was entertaining. And again, I think that kind of maybe flips an expectation you might have of photographic journals in the 19th century. I'm not saying they were all riveting reading, but many of them were really fun, and there's gossip sections and chit-chat sections, and one very polemical editor who got sued for libel because he disparaged one of his colleagues and alleged that he had basically taken a kickback for a photo contest. So the research was very
so much gossip.
So much gossip. So the research sort of encompassed those two sides of things, because I really felt like by going to those primary sources, and really reading what people were writing in about and talking about was a way to help further bring the material to life.
Did you go in thinking you were going to write this kind of very encompassing history? Like what were you thinking the project was going to be when you started to work on it? Or was it just suddenly I'm writing this?
That's interesting. I think it started with more of the physical world. So I started with underwater, and then I went to aerial, and then I started thinking about light and artificial light. And then I started thinking about the moon, or general astronomy. So that was all very physical, and then from there it kind of grew into, and that actually has ended up being the first part of the book. And from there it kind of grew into thinking about also it from a less about the physical space and more about the science space, so how photography impacted medicine and movement and led to motion pictures. And then of course the sort of social aspect of it as well is in here, in terms of the format of photographs, looking at very small photographs that you could use to hide explicit imagery or used to hide codes, to things like surveillance. So it definitely started grounded in the physical world, and then it just sort of expanded out. And then the question was how to sort of harness those different areas into sections and sort of thematize it somewhat. Which I hope, comes through in the book. I hope there's a sense that, there are obviously many histories of photography. And this one is one that I really wanted to write because I just wanted to make, to really highlight that it was exciting and there was a lot happening. Mm-hmm. And every I think it's fair to say every photographic genre we consider to be contemporary. I mean, street photography, set underwater photography, street photography, I mean, you name it, it started in the 19th century.
Yeah, which is really unbelievable.
Yes.
In a way.
Yeah.
Right.
It is.
Yeah.
Especially street photography, I think, and especially that has had such a resurgence with iPhones, right? Like I feel like that idea of photographing somebody on the street really had a resurgence in like the 2010s.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like even talking about street photography feels a little bit antiquated now.
Yes, you're right.
Like street photography, what we're saying is like just photography of anything
Yep,
in the world.
yes, exactly.
Right. But that was such a genre in the 20th century because not everybody was a photographer. Right now, of course, we all are.
We all are,
and
yeah.
we have actually quite good, cameras in our pockets.
Yeah.
But that was a genre that was cultivated in the 20th century. But you're right, it's much older than that, and it has a longer history.
It certainly
there,
does.
which is intertwined with all these different things. I mean, that's kind of the ambition of this project, is that it really shows how photography changed everything, which I absolutely believe is true, and that all of those things were intertwined and not kind of separate lanes. We also, just the idea of genre is also kind of a modern invention.
Yep.
Right, that like there's portraiture and there's landscape, and those are really like artificial inventions, right? Those are categories that we make sense of things with, but that's really not how makers make things.
Yep,
right?
it's true.
That's not really how it worked.
Yeah, I don't think anyone set out saying, I'm going to now create a new genre of photography, and I'm
Yeah.
going to call it aerial photography.
Though they were like, I'm gonna have a little brand in my portrait studio
Yeah.
and like sell people's portraits.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So that, I guess, capitalism created some of the genres.
That's true, but I think as well, it's interesting to just pick up on your point about nothing being kind of siloed.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot about photography, and I kept coming back to it as I was researching and writing the book, was many books written about the 19th century don't have a lot on photography in them.
Mhm.
And that always sort of stuns me, because it was so part of everybody's lives, many people's lives. Not necessarily as photographers, but maybe they would go and see a photo in a gallery. Maybe they would have a carte de visite, which were these small collectible portraits that were hugely popular in the 1860s. It overlapped with all these areas of life and all these different industries. And it was always surprising to me that I felt like maybe it didn't quite get its due sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing I think that you were saying, which is so interesting, is the role, of course, of technology in driving a lot of the changes, both social and actually, genre. We can use that word.
Yeah, so maybe we should talk about the technology too, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the chapters I enjoyed working on a lot. I mean, I enjoyed all of it, but one in particular was to do with the rise of amateur photography, small cameras, easy to use cameras, which all came about because there was this change in photo technology. It became easier. Well, there's basically a new type of process, the dry plate process, where no longer did you need to be futzing around with chemicals and bringing your whole darkroom with you. If you wanted to go and take a landscape view, you could now just buy these plates that were ready to go. And then that drove changes in camera design, because now it's much easier to actually take a photo. You didn't need to have all that stuff. And of course, with the camera design changing, becoming smaller and easier to use, you then have the rise of this person who I have this weird affection for, called the camera fiend, which is somebody who took these very annoying photos of people in awkward moments, like if they had their mouths full, or they were eating, and they were really regarded as this huge pest. And they were. I think I probably just like the name more than the reality of a camera fiend. But that would not have come about, and all the stuff that it led to, including, for example, by the end of the 1890s, at least one publication had a page that was called caught unawares, and it was these like candid photographs of celebrities, which is very much like the tabloids we know today. None of that would have happened without that one technological change. So I think it's interesting to think how the science influences the social and vice versa.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you also think about the way that kind of one use of photography sort of accidentally influences another, right?
Yeah, I think that's true too.
So the technology is kind of used in a way that is not originally intended, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, we saw that, and actually in that same chapter, dealing with amateur photography and small, easy-to-use cameras. That really is kind of what eventually led to surveillance, because in the UK, and this is just astonishing to me, in England, the first kind of group to be subject to government photo surveillance were suffragists. And the person that they hired to do that was someone who had already used a hidden camera, a small hidden camera. He used it in a courtroom to photograph suffragists on trial. And then the technology that enabled him to then take more clandestine photos of suffragists in prison was the telephoto lens. And up until that point, it was new, but it had been used for the 1912 Olympics. It had been used to photograph game, or birds. This was the purpose, and then of course it was repurposed for this whole other, really disconcerting at the minimum use.
Nefarious.
Nefarious use against imprisoned suffragists.
Yeah.
And that was all coming about because they wanted to be able to identify the suffragists if they saw them out of prison. And that's a really good example of how the technology gets used in a way that was definitely unintended.
Right. Yeah. So were there, in the research that you did, were there things that you found, well, you mentioned the camera themed, like were there other, maybe that was your least favorite, but were there kind of favorite characters that you came across, or people that you kind of went down a rabbit hole and became fascinated by?
Definitely. I mean, I certainly did with Thomas Sutton. So he was the individual I mentioned briefly earlier, who was this editor of a photojournal for a long time, who's angry about lots of things. And I think the reason I went down a rabbit hole with him was because he was so opinionated. And at this point, photography was obviously still pretty new. He had become a photographer. He was involved in some of the earliest experiments in color photography. And he also edited this journal in which he was really opinionated about things. And so I kept seeing his name pop up, and it kind of became like a little character that I would look forward to finding out about what he was doing. So he was definitely a character. And then of course, I am really interested in Louis Boutin, who was the French marine biologist who did the underwater photography experiments. And he is fascinating to me, mostly because he did it sort of in his spare time. I mean, he was working at the Arago laboratory on the Mediterranean as a lecturer, and so his underwater experiments was really something he was sort of doing outside of that, which I find admirable.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. That was a hobby.
That was a hobby, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the other person in the book, and this goes back to street photography, is Alice Austin, who was working or living in Staten Island, and she also is one of the amateurs, I guess you could call her technically, because she didn't have a job and she didn't get paid for it, but she approached it as a professional would in terms of her documentation of what she used, in terms of her ability and her approach to cameras. And what is so charming and remarkable about her is, from her we have this dual archive. On the one hand, she went out and took street photographs of New York, which was extraordinary as a woman on her own in the 1890s. And on the other hand, she also took these immensely candid, intimate images of herself and her friends. And it's really, I think, aside to the 19th century photography you don't see, because it precisely is because it was taken by a woman of her friends. And so there is a whole aspect to that I think is lesser known and lesser seen.
She's a really fascinating person.
She is, right?
Yeah, she's amazing. You can visit the Alice Austin house on Staten Island still.
Yep.
And it's been kind of revitalized in a lot of ways recently.
Yep.
Right? And actually the history of her as a queer figure has also been kind of re-examined, which has been really wonderful.
Yeah, and what's extraordinary to me too is how her archive was nearly lost.
Yeah.
I mean, without wanting to sort of sidetrack us away from 19th century photography, she did, her archive was sort of kept, she lost a lot of money, all her thousands and thousands of negatives seemed to be lost and then actually were unearthed in the Staten Island Historical Society. And so it's all the more remarkable that we now have them and can enjoy them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think manipulation was another thing we wanted to talk about. I want to be mindful of time.
Yes,
and
of course.
I'm playing it fast and loose and don't have a watch on,
Okay.
so you have to keep us
I will.
on track. Okay, we're good. So, I mean, it's interesting to think about the way photographs were manipulated in the 19th century, right? Because in a way, as we've sort of said, all photography was a form of manipulation, I would argue.
Yep.
Because it was really framing and changing the way that we saw the world
Yep.
Through this technology or through these many technologies. But then there were some pretty overt manipulations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this sort of also links back to how we started, which is kind of nice. This idea of, is photography an art or is it science? And those that felt like it should not just be a documentation of the world, those were the ones that tried photo manipulation for creative purposes. And there are many reasons to try photo manipulation, right? I mean, you add color to images because of the shortcomings, it was in black and white. You, as a commercial aspect, if you're a portrait photographer and you felt like you could make your customer look a little better, you could retouch them a little bit. But what I find really fascinating are those individuals who used processes like combination printing, which is cutting up of negatives, masking them, and layering them to create their own scene from their imagination. Whether it's an allegorical scene like Oscar Regeländer did, which is an example given in this book, or another scene from life that was really meant to invoke emotions in the viewer. And that's there's a great quote, I think, from Henry Peach Robinson. He created this amazing work that I'm sure you're familiar with if you saw it. It's called Fading Away, and it features this young girl dying of tuberculosis, and her family are gathered around her, and there's all this beautiful light and shade in it, and there's light coming through the window. It's very layered, and it was also made with 5 negatives. And he said that he didn't want to use photography and his words were a dull recorder of uninteresting facts. And he chose tuberculosis deliberately because it was something that was a very emotional topic. And he used this method to combine these negatives and photograph them all separately and stitch them, but pasted them together, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, but what's interesting to me too is he wasn't setting out to deceive. He wasn't saying, this is a real scene from life, but it felt truthful.
Well, that's the thing. Truth truth is obviously very complicated. Yep. You all may have heard this recently. But what I'm thinking actually of the way that a lot of contemporary photographers use photography, and many of them will manipulate photography in a very overt way, right? They're not trying to deceive in the same way. They're actually trying to get to some kind of truth that is beyond just what we can see, right? And through that manipulation or through that heightening of reality, they feel there is truth there, right? And I think that's sort of the same thing that some of these people were getting at.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, like an emotional truth as opposed to a factual truth.
Yeah.
But it definitely it led to a lot of, again, spirited conversations in journals because it was to many, I think, the antithesis of what photography was for.
Right, it became a real ethical question,
Right.
of what was okay.
Yep.
And if we're going to trust this thing in a court of law, and we're going to trust it as scientific evidence, then how can it also be manipulated and that be okay, right? How can we kind of hold all of those things at the same time? And we're still asking those exact same questions,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
None of this has gone away
Yep.
in almost 200 years.
Yep. I think it's evolved and morphed, but I agree.
Yeah, it's changed. It's different, but it's in some ways kind of we're there.
Yeah.
We're still there.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me. And also how they did it, the processes that they used. The example from Regeländer, it was 30 plus negatives. It took him 6 weeks. That was, it wasn't a question of Photoshop or worse, AI. It was him actually cutting out negatives to place them with just the right light and just the right proportions.
And this happened all the time in less obvious ways, right? Edward Muybridge famously loved certain clouds that he printed, and so he would just print in the same clouds
Yep.
over and over again.
Yeah.
And you like see them in different landscapes, and how is that possible?
Absolutely.
That was pretty common practice.
I love that detail. I love that by the late 1870s, if you wanted to, you could just buy basically like a stock photograph of a cloud.
Yeah.
Basically the 19th century version of Getty Images. You
Yeah.
go and get your
Yeah,
cloud,
get a cloud.
and you'd stick it in your
Nice
landscape.
cloud. Yeah.
But even that arose not because anybody was trying to, when they were seeking a particularly emotional truth, I don't think, they had a problem with the emulsions being able to register the sky without it being blank.
Yeah.
So they just wanted to make it more true to life as they saw it at the time, which is complex.
Yeah, for sure. So should we open things up if anyone
Definitely.
has comments or questions?
Yes, I would love that.
Yeah.
Yes. In your book, do you get into the 19th century fad for so-called spirit photography? And then, yes, and
Yes.
then later, or at one point, the Cottingley fairies?
Cottingley Fairies was a bit later, but I do
Yes,
love that
it was
as an
later.
example. But I certainly get into spirit photography as part of the conversation on photo manipulation, as part of the conversation on both the techniques used, you know, the double exposure, and also the idea of, as what Jess was just saying earlier, about how trustworthy is photography, you know, and how in France, for example, there was a spirit photographer who had a very elaborate process by which he duped his clients, and the reason we know this is because he was arrested and then pretty much straight away confessed to everything, and they found in the second room in his studio a bunch of masks that he would sort of clip on to a mannequin for the first exposure and then make the second exposure with his actual customer. So there's certainly examples of that in this book as well, and the question of how and why people might believe that.
How widely do you think the Cottingley fairies were believed?
That's a
When
good
you
question.
look at them, you know, they're so, at least today, they're so obvious.
Should we explain this for the uninitiated? to
Yes.
The fairies?
So it was in, I think it's like 1920, right? So it was
Yeah.
somewhat later.
A little bit later.
It was later though, wasn't it?
Was
It was the early 20th century.
Yeah.
but-
Yeah.
30s or 40s or something.
Oh, I don't think it was that late, no. Yes, there was, somebody had manipulated photographs of using fairies sort of at the end of somebody's garden, and it was widely believed, including by
Conan Doyle.
thank you, yes, Conan Doyle. And it really became kind of this huge event in terms of, does it show, is this fair? Is this real? Yeah. But I mean, the same debates were happening with spirit photography 40 years earlier. Do these photos really show ghosts? Particularly if the practitioners in question never came clean about what they're actually doing, which is the example in the book I have of Mumla, who was a famous spirit photographer in Boston and in New York. You know, he also went on trial, but never said what he did or did not do. And that opaqueness, I think, allowed people to continue to believe in him.
Didn't the girls in the Cottingley fairy case though finally admit they had cut out these fanciful looking figures from magazines and, you know, basically stuck them up in the landscape and, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They did. I mean, they did all of it.
I have a question. When you talk about the, how long the exposure was in taking the picture of the street, how long did it have to be exposed to take the picture of the street?
I can't remember the specific number of minutes, but I think in the early days, you know, when the daguerreotype was first announced in 1839, the exposures were far too long to have a portrait. They were minutes, in like, yeah. And then only when they improved the chemical processes and the lenses did portraiture become an option, which was like 1841-ish. So the street scene that Daguerre took, it escapes me exactly how long it was, but it would have been minutes, definitely, yeah. And that was the other thing, back to the point about, you know, no manuals or guidebooks. I mean, it's so interesting when you research exposures at this time and everyone's saying, well, you know, I sort of looked out the window and I looked at how foggy it was and how sunny it was, and I kind of thought about what time of year is it, and then they went from there. And it varied enormously depending on time of year. You know, your exposure, if you're in England anyway, your exposure in May would be very different to your exposure in November.
I love the reading, getting
Thank
the
you.
description of the sitting for a portrait. The prunings will never
That's real.
come out of my mouth the same way again. But and then you talked about well, in that situation about the importance of getting light exactly right and all that. Then we went to underwater photography, and I'm trying to make that work in my head in terms of the light.
Yep.
As well as the lack of movement, because
Great.
water and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, How?
Great. I mean, exactly. I mean, that was
How?
How is great.
That's
Yeah.
a great reason to read the book.
That could have been the title. How?
Yes.
Well, I think the reading that I started with is mid 1840s, and the experiments in underwater photography that I go into in depth in the book, pardon the pun, is 1890s. So there were a huge amount of
Okay.
technological developments.
Okay.
He wasn't using a daguerreotype. He
Right.
was using dry blades. But you're absolutely right. There were still enormous issues with light, with water pressure, of
Mhm.
course, and with movement, stillness.
Well, I mean, just the water.
Just the water,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that first example we gave from 1856 of the man who dropped the camera over the side of the boat, I mean, technically it is an underwater photograph. I can't say it looks like the underwater, if you were to imagine just like a scene of Grey, that would be kind of what it came out as.
Yeah.
We're not talking about crystal clear
Right.
fish images. But the ones in the 1890s are, especially toward the end of the 1890s, are astonishingly clear. And the picture of the diver, which is in the book, is, I think, one of my favorite photos from this era whatsoever. It's really quite magical. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you talk about a photographer who maybe is not that well known, and perhaps it might be one of your favorite photographers, but someone who was kind of wild and crazy and did dangerous things, just different from everybody else?
Yeah, I can think of a couple of examples. Muybridge is a great example, but he's very well known. He did the motion picture, the horse in motion photographs. I do think somebody that I have a real kind of affection for. I think probably because we don't know a lot about him is Carlton Watkins. Are you familiar with Carlton Watkins? He was actually from upstate New York. He traveled to California at some point in the 1850s, and at some point took up photography. It's all a little bit of a mystery as to how and when and why. And then at some point he got the idea in his mind that he wanted to create mammoth plate photographs, which are 20 inches by 16 or so. And that may not sound like much of an undertaking to us today. It's a big photograph. But the reality is to get a print that large, you need a negative that large. So we're talking a glass plate negative that's 20 by 16. And
So
it's for
camera,
that.
that
And the
whole
camera,
camera.
exactly. And then the developing trays, and then the number of chemicals, and the water that you needed. And so he decided to take those of Yosemite, which was a long trip from San Francisco.
Yes, and not like the trails of Yosemite National Park
No,
at all.
zero.
Right, this
Yeah.
is like real intrepid stuff.
Absolutely.
With a giant camera.
With a giant camera, and his accounts of from other trips. Again, there's little of his archive left, but there's accounts from other visitors at that time of the dangers of the rattlesnakes and the dust alone for his camera, for his equipment.
Yeah.
He took multiple trips to Yosemite, and one of them he was reported as having 2,000 pounds of equipment. So, and then he kind of was forgotten even in his own lifetime, or toward the end of his lifetime, quite sadly.
Yeah, he had kind of a sad end of
He had a
life.
very sad end of life. But I think, he's also a great example of somebody whose work did change or at least influence the course of history, because his mammoth photographs of Yosemite, not only did they go on display in New York for the first time people were actually seeing a landscape that they had only ever read about, maybe seen paintings of, but they also were used, they were influential at least in signing and creating legislation to protect Yosemite.
I actually saw his retrospective at the
Did
Getty,
you? Oh,
and
amazing.
It's very impressive, probably one of the best photo shows I've ever seen.
I'm sure.
And the fact that he carried all this tonnage of equipment on a donkey on cliffs and mountains.
Yep.
Like,
What time period?
He first went in the 1860s, 1861, 1862.
Yeah, really early.
And then he went back several times. And he also went and photographed all up and down the West Coast. He went to Oregon, to Alaska even. But that show must have been wonderful.
yeah, it was.
Yeah.
One thing that occurs to me is that this original period of photography coincided with what they call the golden age of book illustrations, where alongside photographs, they developed all kinds of new methods of printing and lithographs and then color lithographs and so on. And people were made sort of nervous by that, just overwhelmed by the sheer number and variety of images that were suddenly available. How did that work in connection with photography?
It's great. As you were talking, I was reminded of this quote that I was reading from Emerson, which was that he said that of the era in which photography came about and all the developments you're talking about is our age is ocular, meaning everybody was looking at everything all the time. And I think it's interesting to consider photography in that context, because it wasn't really until the 1880s that you could reproduce a photograph accurately and directly in a publication. Up until that point, it was an engraving. So somebody translated the picture, maybe embellished it, maybe took something out from the photo that was a bit awkward, and they put it on a like a wood block, and they put it as an engraving in the publication. So that was sort of how photography was represented in print for a long time. But there were still other ways to see photographs, not just in galleries, but also through the stereoscope, which is this device whereby you look through these two little eye holes at a pair of images, and they appear three-dimensional. So people would have those in their houses and use them to look at imagery that they couldn't otherwise see in the press.
And it was a really interesting process too. I think one of the myths of this period is that as soon as photography was invented, it immediately was the thing that everybody trusted, and it replaced sketch reporting and these things, and that really wasn't the case. As you're saying, it was kind of an overwhelm, and people were a little bit wait, what is this new thing? It really was very jarring to a lot of people at first, and it looked very weird in print at first, and it took time to kind of get used to it. So it was a real mix of seeing, engravings in the newspaper, but also some photography and a whole sort of mix of different kinds of images. Yeah.
What was the actual chemicals that for the early flash bulbs?
Oh, the early, the flash powder?
Powder, yeah. What
It was
it?
usually, I'm on the spot, I forget them. Powdered magnesium, and then it depended on the formula. So they were always a little bit opaque about the formulas, especially the manufacturers. They would say that they were safe, but they weren't really safe. I think it was potassium chlorate, and I can't remember what the third one is now, it's coming to me. But they're all basically pyrotechnic chemicals. These are all things that would go into fireworks. Extremely dangerous.
And they were doing this,
gunpowder.
indoors.
No gunpowder, although there was gun cotton in the wet collodion emulsion. So wet collodion was a combination of gun cotton, ether, and alcohol. And there was accounts of people who, employees of collodion manufacturers, who would be packing gun cotton into a case and it just exploding and killing them or taking the front of the building off. I mean, there's a lot of pyrotechnics involved.
On that note.
Yeah.
Another
On that bombshell.
Do you think this history of photography can tell us about the reception and potential of recent technologies such as cell phones and the internet? I think we have the same fear of being overwhelmed, and it's because people have just felt that before, it doesn't mean that our fear might not be justified and might not be warranted.
That's a really good point. I think, and the one thing that, as I was working on this book, the one thing that I found a renewed appreciation for photography. I think we are saturated with images today, I mean, without question, not just on our phones, but on social media. And so, and it feels to me like it's so easy to take a photograph. There's oftentimes not consideration and thought and that goes into the process of it. And so for me, I think this book might be a way to kind of hit pause on what we see now, all the saturation of imagery, and really appreciate what has come before and how difficult it was to do it, and all the advances and strides that have taken us to where we are today. And I think a lot of it also, it is interesting to consider the debates about AI images that are going on today as well, which I think is concerning for a lot of people, myself included, and how that relates to the early days of manipulation and the debates about that nearly 200 years ago.
Well, thank you. Oh, thank you.